Good evening. Thank you. Good evening. I'm John Miko, the president of Founding Forward. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Civil War Roundtable. As I think you all know, Founding Forward is the nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia. We use the history, the spirit, and the values of this great institution for many different programs that are all centered around civics education. And our civic education is now centered really in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Several of you have asked just tonight when you can come to our beautiful campus in Valley Forge, and the answer is go to the website and sign up. We have tours that are happening on Saturdays throughout the next, I think, probably the next several months. Please go. We'd love to see you out in Valley Forge for a tour of not just the academic campus, but our beautiful Medal of Honor Grove. And we also have speaker programs that will be happening there. We have 2 scheduled so far, but go online, look for them, and we look forward to seeing you in beautiful campus in Valley Forge. Tonight's program, we will have Q&A at the end of the program. We'll do that via mic. And remember, very short questions, and they should be questions. If you can't put a question mark at the end of it, you have failed. So please, very short. Please silence your cell phones. If you'll take a moment to do that, we'd appreciate that. Our next program is not until, speaker program is not until April 10th because we have so many other programs that are happening in the next few weeks. But it's a Civil War Roundtable, Political Violence and Lincoln's Election. So a similar theme. We'll find out how it actually worked out, right, this convention, with John Grinspan. And then we have a whole host of programs, speaker programs in April and May. One of the reasons we are taking a little bit of a breather from speaker programs is Good Citizen Days in 2 weeks, where we'll have 250 to 300 students in this room and a day like no other of civic education. So we thank you. All that happens because of your support. We thank you for that support. We need it desperately. Our nation needs it desperately, and I thank you. And now, with no further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you to the chair of the Education Committee who will introduce our program, Mr. Steve Target. Steve.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm curious this evening, how many in the audience are guests, maybe non-Union League members? Will you raise your hand? Wonderful. Welcome to the Union League. Welcome to Founding Forward. Edward Achorn began his career in journalism, where he primarily covered politics at the local, state, and federal level. He was the vice president and editorial pages editor of the Providence Journal. He was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for a commentary for his columns about political corruption in Rhode Island. In addition to winning numerous local and regional awards, he was the winner of the Yankee Quill Award for lifetime service to journalism and was elected to the New England Academy of Journalists. He retired from journalism in 2020 after 41 years in the business, and since then he's worked full-time writing about history. Achorn is the author of 2 critically acclaimed books about Abraham Lincoln. His Every Drop of Blood, the momentous second inauguration of Abraham Lincoln, was named one of the best books in 2020 by The Economist magazine. His new book, The Lincoln Miracle, Inside the Republican Convention That Changed History, received the Harold Holzer Lincoln Forum Book Prize for the best book about Abraham Lincoln, published in 2023. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Edward Achorn.
As Steve mentioned, I've been writing about politics for a very long time. And that's an interesting word, politics. It comes from 2 words, poly, meaning many, and ticks, meaning blood-sucking parasites. But as somebody who spends all his time, a little bit of time every day in the 1860s, it's such a thrill to be in this building with this club. And I think your Founding Forward is just a marvelous contribution to our country. And I'm very grateful for the work you do. Lincoln had a special feeling for Philadelphia. He stopped here on his way on his journey to the White House. And he said, all the political sentiments I entertain here have been drawn from the sentiments which originated and were given to the world from Independence Hall in this city. Lincoln said, "I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence." So it's always a thrill for me to be in Philadelphia. Oops. I've already screwed it up. Okay, a little bit more about my background. I started off in 19th century history with another side of American culture, the great game of baseball. 59 and 84 was about the grittiest of competitors, Hall of Fame pitcher Old Hoss Radbourn, who won more games in a single season than any pitcher in history, something players and managers well into the 20th century considered the greatest feat ever in baseball. But he was a rather strange figure. A relative contended that Radbourn drank a quart of whiskey a day at the peak of his career. And he was so ornery, he dressed in the other team's locker room because he couldn't stand his own teammates. And he was apparently the first man ever photographed giving the middle finger. And you might notice what he's doing with his left hand on the cover of that book. My second book was The Summer of Beer and Whiskey, about a crazy early major league, the American Association, and how immigrants saved the game when it was going under. And that book is still selling very well. I have to guess the title didn't hurt. But of course, anyone who wants to know about and write about the most remarkable figure of the 19th century has to be drawn to Abraham Lincoln. It has been my extraordinary privilege in recent years to have spent day and night in the company of Lincoln, immersed in his world and his observations. I was trained as an old-fashioned journalist to search earnestly for the other side, and I've spent a great deal of time investigating the evidence that Lincoln was a tyrant and a white supremacist. But I found that no matter how relentlessly I focus on Lincoln's flaws and errors, this man's humanity, integrity, pragmatism, and courage shine through. Lincoln told a story about meeting a woman on horseback in the woods. He waited for her to pass, but instead she scrutinized him carefully before saying, "Well, for land's sake, you are the homeliest man I ever saw." "Yes, madam, but I can't help it," he replied. "No, I suppose not, but you might stay at home." Well, I can relate to that story. As someone whose training was in daily journalism rather than academia, I've often felt like something of an interloper in the field of Lincoln scholarship. I might have stayed home too. Thousands of books about Abraham Lincoln have been published, supposedly more than any human being other than Jesus Christ. And I admit that was daunting. But what made me proceed with my 2020 book, Every Drop of Blood, was the feeling that there was a story about Lincoln that had never been told in this way. The story is basically 24 hours in Lincoln's life, from the evening of March 3rd, 1865, through his second inauguration, to the evening of March 4th, 1865. And that's a lens through which I think we can see in remarkably sharp detail the monstrous suffering unleashed by the Civil War, and to grasp the ultimate meaning of that war, as Lincoln explained that meaning in what I believe was his greatest and most profound speech, his second inaugural address. I was struck by the very famous people who kept popping in and out of the story that day, interacting with Lincoln and with each other, interwoven like a rich tapestry. The great black leader Frederick Douglass, who watched Lincoln deliver his speech and later discussed it with him at a White House reception. The popular actor John Wilkes Booth, who stalked Lincoln and evidently stalked Lincoln at the inauguration, and I think intended to kill him that day. The great American poet Walt Whitman, who covered the inaugural events for the New York Times. The angel of the battlefield, Clara Barton, who spent the week trying to meet with Lincoln and finally greeted him at the reception. And the Vice President, Andrew Johnson, who showed up at the inauguration drunk. The perspectives of these very different people provide a powerful and moving view of what that war was about and what Lincoln was up against on that rainy, muddy day in Washington. And I try to weave them into the story. At the center of it all, of course, is Abraham Lincoln, who can be seen standing in the middle of this crowd reading his speech just above the table with a glass of water on it. He did something that day that no other politician would. On the cusp of victory after 4 years of a brutal, divisive, and widely despised war, he declined to make a speech about the Union's impending triumph. Instead, he argued that both sides had been wrong, that the misery that both sides had shared might have been the price required for ending the terrible moral wrong of slavery. After all of this misery, Lincoln argued that it was time for Americans to stop thinking about self-righteousness. The only way forward, he argued, was to recognize that all had been wrong, to sacrifice hatred and vengeance, and to treat each other with mercy, with malice toward none, with charity for all. Now, I think that a very narrow focus on a historical event can give us an understanding that the usual omniscient view cannot. Brings us very close to the ground instead of viewing everything from 30,000 feet up. Studied over the course of a few days, historical figures almost magically become flesh and blood, real human beings, subject to emotions and other vicissitudes, including the politics of the moment. It becomes clearer that they were groping in the dark and had no idea how things would turn out, just like us. With this forced perspective, we also get a stronger sense of how everything looked, sounded, and smelled. Well, I adopted that approach, which some call microhistory, in my new book, The Lincoln Miracle. In that book, we go back 5 years before that inauguration to 1 week in Chicago in May 1860. At the time, many Northerners were fed up with the political bullying, corruption, and censorship of the Democrats. Since Democrats had split between North and South and were unable to choose a candidate at their convention in Charleston days earlier, Republicans who gathered in Chicago knew they had a very real chance of nominating the next president of the United States. And the political struggle that took place that week, I do believe, constituted a miracle for Lincoln and for the United States. We tend to forget that Lincoln went in as the darkest of dark horses. After all, he had lost 2 elections for the US Senate and had not held public office in more than a decade. An Illinois paper said of him, quote, "Lincoln is undoubtedly the most unfortunate politician that ever attempted to rise in Illinois. In everything he undertakes politically, he seems doomed to failure. He has been prostrated enough in his political schemes to have crushed the life out of any ordinary man." Lincoln had almost no formal education, and his country mannerisms struck many people as quaint at best. He told dirty jokes. His executive experience was pretty much limited to running a 2-man law office. Lincoln himself had told people he did not think himself fit for the presidency. And 2 years earlier, he had declared with roaring laughter, "Just think of such a sucker as me as president." In early 1860, when he visited New York City, he struck many people as crude. He had trouble deciphering a menu with many dishes in French until a waiter mentioned beans. Lincoln's face brightened, and he said, "Hold on there, bring me beans. I know beans." In fact, Lincoln's chances seemed so remote that the leaders of the Republican National Committee approved Chicago as the convention site, in part because they thought it was neutral ground. No serious candidate came from Illinois. The candidates in those days did not show up at the convention, and Lincoln was such a long shot that he contemplated attending. He told a friend he felt like he was too much of a candidate to go and not quite enough to stay at home. In the end, he wisely stayed back in Springfield. The book begins on Saturday, May 12th, 1860. On that morning, David Davis, 45, left his home in Bloomington, Illinois, and took the 140-mile train trip up to Chicago. There he discovered no one was in charge, and the Lincoln campaign was so disorganized that nobody had even booked a room to serve as its headquarters. Davis, a 300-pound judge who had come to know Lincoln intimately while traveling the 8th Judicial Circuit with him, immediately took over as Lincoln's manager without any official appointment. He bribed a family to leave its rooms, put a Lincoln headquarters sign on the door, and barely slept for the next 6 days. In this lithograph center spread of the candidates published that same day, Harper's Weekly played Lincoln's picture at the bottom with the also-rans. Its written description of Lincoln was dead last among all the candidates. At best, people were talking about Lincoln as a possible vice presidential nominee, coming as he did from an important swing state. Oops. There we go. The candidate from Pennsylvania was Simon Cameron, a senator, political boss, wealthy banker, and transportation mogul. Everyone knew that Pennsylvania, then as now, would be a crucial swing state in the election. And Cameron's chief selling point was that he could deliver the state. Unfortunately, he had a rank reputation as greedy and dishonest. Lincoln himself said later that Cameron's very name stinks in the nostrils of the people for his corruption. Years earlier, Cameron had served as a commissioner to settle claims of the Winnebago Indians, and the charge that he had cheated them had earned him the sarcastic nickname Old Winnebago. A Pennsylvania lawyer and Republican activist named Thomas Marshall asserted that he could, quote, go through a dark alley at midnight, and the first man I caught would make a better president than Simon Cameron. As a result, the Pennsylvania delegation was split between allies and bitter enemies of Old Winnebago. But front and center, with the biggest picture and the first and longest write-up, was the superstar of the Republican Party, the former governor of New York and then current U.S. Senator William Seward. Seward was regarded as the founder and father of the Republican Party. He was a bold opponent of slavery and defender of the rights of immigrants, and he was managed by a brilliant political strategist named Thurlow Weed, who could make or break senators and presidents. He had more money behind him than any candidate. Seward had traveled to Europe several months before the convention, where he capped his preparation for the presidency by meeting with world leaders, including Queen Victoria, Pope Pius IX, and France's Emperor Napoleon III. When he returned, he was mobbed by Americans who wanted him to be the next president. He was far and away the most popular candidate with the delegates gathering in Chicago. But his strength was deceptive. This man is radical abolitionist John Brown. The previous October, he had raided a federal armory and planned to provide slaves with guns for a violent insurrection against whites. While Brown was apprehended and hanged, the incident infuriated the South and terrified many voters in the North. Many thought that all the slavery talk was putting impossible pressures on the political system and threatening to break the nation in two and ignite a bloody civil war. And nobody was more famous for anti-slavery rhetoric than William Seward. Though Lincoln had made many of the same points against slavery, he was far less well known to swing voters, and thus not as threatening. On top of that, Seward had openly supported immigrants and was close to Catholic leaders, something that turned off a sizable portion of the Republican base, who feared that rampant immigration was helping Democrats steal elections and destroying America from within. Former members of the American Party, often called the Know-Nothing Party, might well bolt from the Republicans if they nominated Seward. Lincoln's position on immigrants, meanwhile, was so little known that some people assumed he was a know-nothing. In truth, Lincoln despised the movement and liked to tell a story about a man who helped with his gardening, an Irish immigrant named Patrick. Lincoln asked Pat why he had not been born in America. "Fate, Mr. Lincoln," he said, "I wanted to be, but me mother wouldn't let me." One of the most striking things that quickly became clear in my research was that these men gathered in Chicago were not choosing a candidate on the basis of who might make the best president in a national crisis. Their biggest concern by far was who would get the most Republicans elected, which meant power, jobs, and money. The pro-Lincoln Chicago Press and Tribune appealed to this naked self-interest in an editorial aimed at arriving delegates. Quote, "Constables are worth more than presidents in the long run as a means of holding political power. The legislature is of vastly more consequence to particular states than their delegations in Congress. We look to Mr. Lincoln to tow constables and General Assembly members into power. The gods help those who help themselves." Lincoln's men repeatedly made that case that week to the delegates. There was something else going for Lincoln that wasn't immediately apparent to the national press. Though he was obscure and had been defeated repeatedly in the political realm, he was well known and well liked in Illinois. During his years working the 8th District Circuit Court in central Illinois, he had been going to small towns and making friends with his funny stories and his fairness, kindness, and intelligence. As a result, Judge David Davis could oversee a team of diehards ready to work themselves to exhaustion for him in Chicago, and they could afford to do it because the convention was taking place in state. That loyalty made all the difference. Lincoln's strategy was simple but effective. He knew he wasn't the first choice of many delegates, so he made sure his men didn't criticize any of the other candidates, while pushing him as a second best option. "Our policy," he wrote, "is to give no offense to others, to leave them in a mood to come to us if they shall be compelled to give up their first love." Now, early in the convention, the chief alternative to Seward appeared to be a Missouri judge named Edward Bates, a conservative man who did not like all this talk and agitation about slavery. His supporters argued he would calm the South and negate all threats of secession, and he had the backing of some very powerful forces, including the most influential newspaper editor in the country, Horace Greeley, who was angry at Seward for blocking his political career. But unfortunately for Bates, German immigrants were dead set against him because he had flirted with the Know-Nothing Party. Prominent Germans went so far as to hold their own national convention that same week, just down the road from the Republican one, sending a terrifying signal to the delegates. German immigrants made up only a small percentage of Republican voters, but they were enough to sway elections in many northern states. The delegates did not dare go with Bates. And I call this book The Lincoln Miracle in part because so many things beyond Lincoln's control had to slot into place perfectly to advance him. A bit about the site of the convention. Chicago in 1860 was a powerful symbol of the American spirit of daring and innovation. Just 25 years earlier, it had been a small cluster of primitive cabins around Fort Dearborn on the swampy banks of the Chicago River. But its location turned it overnight into a roaring transportation hub. By 1860, its population had soared to 112,000, making it the nation's ninth largest city. Its skyline was dominated by giant grain elevators, and it was already connected by more rail lines than any city on the globe. Unfortunately, that explosive growth left it overrun by rats and by disease. In 1860, the downtown was in the midst of lifting all of its buildings with giant corkscrews so that the street level could be raised, and sewer pipes buried. Its dirt streets were horribly muddy when it rained and horribly dusty when it didn't. The Chicago River had the color and consistency of pea soup and stank so badly that women had to cover their noses with handkerchiefs when shopping downtown. This is the wigwam, built of wood, thrown up in just 6 weeks to host the convention. Fitting up to 11,000 people, it was the largest indoor auditorium in America. And this is inside of the wigwam, viewed from the ladies' gallery upstairs. This is looking down on the giant stage on the left there, where the delegates were sitting in 2 groups, with the press in the middle. The task of assigning seating on stage was given to a Chicago lawyer, Norman Judd, a Republican National Committee member who happened to be a close friend of Lincoln. To tilt the playing field, he put the solid Seward votes all on one side, but the doubtful ones on the other side. That made it easier for the Lincoln forces to negotiate with the swing delegates between votes, but almost impossible for the Seward men to reach them. There was no electric amplification back then, but the way the structure was designed with that curved ceiling, speakers' voices could be heard all over the hall. Ladies got first dibs on seats in parts of this gallery, which made them valuable assets for men trying to get inside. Quickly, men began picking up any woman on the street, including washerwomen, schoolgirls, and prostitutes, and paying them to come inside with them. A man tried to bribe one woman to come with him, but she refused, saying she had already entered the wigwam 6 times before. And then she had snuck back outside, and she was afraid she'd be arrested if she tried it again. The decorations here were put up by the ladies of Chicago, and you can imagine with gas lights flaring amid evergreens, unfinished wood, and cloth bunting. The wigwam must have been, as historian Bruce Catton noted, one of the most dangerous fire traps ever built in America. Seward's manager, Thurlow Weed, there on the left, understood crowd psychology and the herd instinct, and he brought thousands of supporters with him by train to Chicago. They led huge parades in the streets and filled up the wigwam, creating a strong impression of the inevitability of Seward's nomination. Lincoln's team was paltry by comparison, but it was dedicated and led by a very shrewd man. Judge Davis discovered early on that many professional politicians were afraid of Seward and casting about for an alternative. Bloomington lawyer Leonard Swett arrived on Monday, thinking Lincoln was nothing more than a favorite son candidate and that he would fade after Illinois voted. But Davis made a startling statement to him. "If you will put yourself at my disposal day and night, I believe Lincoln can be nominated." Lawyer Nathan Knapp sent Lincoln a letter that Monday. "Things are working. Keep a good nerve. Be not surprised at any result, but I tell you that your chances are not the worst." Charles Ray, editor-in-chief of the Chicago Press and Tribune, told Lincoln, "As things stand today, I'd rather have your chances than those of any other man, but don't get excited." On Tuesday night, David Davis and Jesse Du Bois fired off a telegram to Lincoln, informing their friend that they were moving heaven and earth for him. They added, hopefully, "Nothing will beat us but old fogey politicians. The heart of the delegates are with us." Unfortunately, when the convention started on Wednesday, Lincoln's men had still been unable to persuade enough delegates that he was the best alternative to Seward. On Thursday evening, 2 days into the convention, the delegates had not settled on a Seward alternative. The New Yorker had won a series of test votes that day and was poised to win the nomination when another miracle occurred. The tally sheets for voting had not yet arrived at the podium, and the delegates were so hungry by that point that they decided to adjourn and vote the next day rather than wait for a few minutes. For want of tally sheets, Seward was not nominated that evening. That gave the Lincoln men more time to defeat him. On such slender threads hang the destiny of nations. The Lincoln men worked hard that night. Judge Davis countered Seward's psychological advantages by finding champion shouters and assigning them spaces in the hall for maximum effect Friday. And somebody on the team managed to print counterfeit admission tickets to the wigwam. After the Seward forces staged a final grand parade with marching bands Friday morning, they arrived at the wigwam to find their seats occupied, even though they had tickets. The shouting of the Lincoln supporters would create an illusion of great strength. Davis had also worked overnight selling cabinet positions and other offices for support. Lincoln had sent a message from Springfield warning his supporters to make no deals in his name. Davis told his team, "Lincoln ain't here. He don't know what we have to meet, so we will go ahead as if we hadn't heard from him, and then he must ratify it." One of the crucial deals involved this man, Pennsylvania's Simon Cameron. Before Lincoln's men went to Chicago, Lincoln had told them, if they ever got close to the nomination, I want that big Pennsylvania foot brought down on the scale. A close Lincoln associate, Ward Hill Layman, thought Cameron's candidacy had all along been a mere sham, got up to enable Cameron to make a bargain with some real candidate and secure for himself the lion's share of the spoils in the event of a victory in the polls. In fact, it appears that David Davis, at a meeting in the pre-dawn hours of Friday morning, broke down and promised Cameron's team the most patronage-rich plum in the cabinet, which was Secretary of the Treasury. When Davis came down the stairs after the meeting, he told an ally, "Damned if we haven't got them." The ally asked him how he did it. "By paying their price," Davis replied. This was just one of the deals Davis had made that he did not know would stick until the actual voting the next day. In fact, he confessed later that he promised some of the same offices to multiple delegations. "You must have prevaricated somewhat," a friend responded to his story. "Prevaricated?" Davis replied. "Prevaricated? We lied like hell." Lincoln was way behind Seward on the first ballot, but with his men inside screaming and the Pennsylvania delegation flipping to Lincoln as promised, Lincoln captured the nomination on the third ballot. His victory astounded many of the people in the hall, never mind the nation outside. The political professionals at the wigwam had accepted him as the candidate who was as bitterly opposed to slavery as Seward, and thus appealing to the party's base, but much less famous and thus not as scary to swing voters. And unlike Bates, he was not offensive to immigrant voters. So all of these things, John Brown, the know-nothings, the Germans, the location of the convention, the momentary lack of tally sheets, all of them slotted into place perfectly for Lincoln. The party insiders also knew that they could sell Lincoln's classic rags to riches story of lifting himself from a poor childhood in a log cabin. He was already known as the rail splitter for having split thousands of rails after he came to Illinois. He did seem an unusually modest man. Soon after getting the news from Chicago by telegraph, Lincoln walked home alone. "There's a little woman down at our house who would like to hear this," he said. The Seward supporters were livid to see the nomination stolen away from them, and they blamed this man, New York Tribune editor Horace Greeley. Greeley, who was probably most famous for saying, "Go west, young man," spent the week warning delegates that Seward was too controversial to win. The Seward men thought it was all an act of vengeance, since Weed and Seward had refused to make Greeley lieutenant governor of New York, giving the job instead to New York Times editor Henry Raymond. Greeley had a lot of influence with Republicans, and his timely opposition was another reason the Lincoln miracle happened. After the vote, Greeley had the nerve to show up at New York headquarters where delegates cursed him to his face. Seward's men, one reporter wrote, accuse Greeley of stabbing Seward and say he shall be paid for it. In less than a year, he was paid for it. The Seward team got its revenge by blocking Greeley from the U.S. Senate. Though Seward put on a good face, he was also devastated, thinking himself far superior to an ill-educated and inexperienced rail splitter. Before the November election, Lincoln invited him repeatedly to visit him in Springfield, and Seward only condescended to stop his train at the station there while heading to a speech in Chicago on October 2nd. Lincoln had to wait on the platform for the great man and then fight his way through the crowd to get to Seward inside the railroad car. After Lincoln approached, Seward delivered a calculated snub. As one reporter noted, Seward rose from his seat, shook hands with him, introduced him to the ladies and gentlemen in his company, and then, without entering into a conversation of even formal courtesy with him, resumed his seat. Like most presidential candidates of the time, Lincoln sat out the election, remaining at his house in Springfield, refusing to comment on the crisis engulfing America. Here he's out front to the right of the door as a massive campaign parade stopped on August 8th. He did communicate with an 11-year-old girl named Grace Bedell, who advised him to grow whiskers. "Your face is so thin," she wrote. "All the ladies like whiskers, and they would tease their husbands to vote for you, and then you would be president." Lincoln listened and grew his famous beard. Whether the whiskers helped or not, he did win the presidency handily in the Electoral College, though he captured only 39% of the popular vote, the second smallest percentage of any victor in our nation's history. His name was not even on the ballot in the Deep South, though he proved very popular in the North. Well, the delegates who nominated him succeeded in getting their jobs, power, and patronage for the most part, but they had no real idea of Lincoln's greatness, of his political brilliance, humanity, pragmatism, flair for the English language, and the powers of endurance that would be crucial to the nation's survival and the end of slavery during the Civil War. A reporter on the scene at the Wigwam later wrote, "They had nominated the plain, everyday, storytelling, mirth-provoking Lincoln of the hustings, the husk only of the Lincoln of history. It took 4 fearful years to give the event its true relations and right proportions, and it was not until the veil was drawn by an assassin's hand that the real Lincoln was revealed." He concluded that the delegates had been the unconscious instruments of a higher power. So much had to come together perfectly for Lincoln that I think the word miracle is not an exaggeration. Well, that's a whirlwind tour through the book. I'm so grateful to you all for coming out, and I'm open to any questions you might have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Achorn. We do have time for questions. Again, if you have a question, just raise your hand and staff will come to you. Over here, Kristen. Mr. Lloyd.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. Just wonder how you reconcile Lincoln selecting one of his rivals, William Seward, for Secretary of State after his campaign chair, Davis, promised so many plum jobs to others.
Lincoln was amazing how he refused to harbor resentments against people. It's one of the most remarkable things you could ever see. And he knew he needed Seward's stature and his money and his machine and everything to be successful as president. And so he brought him into the cabinet in his top position, Secretary of State. And it's quite extraordinary. Seward, during the first month of Lincoln's presidency, Seward acted like he was the president. He kept going, talking to the press. He was working behind Lincoln's back, doing all sorts of stuff, including sending messages to the South that the United States would abandon Fort Sumter. And it's amazing. And on April 1st, the second month of Lincoln's presidency, Seward wrote a letter to Lincoln saying, we don't have any policies at administration. Essentially, this has been a disaster. Somebody has to be given power to enact our decisions. And I'm not saying it should be me, but if you want to make it me, that would be fine. Lincoln responded and said, no, if anybody has to make decisions, it has to be me. But I don't think he gave that letter to Seward. I think he set it aside and went and talked to Seward personally, saying, look, you're not the president, I am. And what is remarkable is Seward backed down. Lincoln did not take offense. And by June, Seward was writing to his wife about Lincoln's extraordinary executive abilities. And he said, he's the best of us. So it's just, I think it's a tribute to both men that they rose above their differences. And Seward became Lincoln's most trusted advisor during that war. And I think he played a big role in helping Lincoln steer through that war. So it's just, I think that's a great story. Anything else?
Over here.
Yeah, can you say a bit more about the very numerous women who were at the convention? Because I guess they weren't all washerwomen being paid, right? So what were they doing there under the circumstances that they didn't have a vote?
They didn't have a vote, they couldn't be delegates, but women were passionately interested in politics. And the politicians knew that sort of women wielded a great influence at the home. So they tried to appeal to women any way they could. But in the 19th century, I know this from researching baseball, but they had special sections for women at baseball parks. And theaters had special sections for women, basically so they wouldn't be harassed by obnoxious men. So they had a special place at the convention hall. And the women were very active they turned up for the convention, they made their voices heard, they were in charge of decorating the whole wigwam, and so they played a role in this thing. And there was also the first woman reporter covering a convention was at this convention, and I wrote about her a little bit.
Kira, question in the back.
Thank you for your talk. Thanks for being here. Quick question. After the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln did not think he did a good job, and the reaction, particularly in the North, was not very positive to it. What was the reaction to the second inaugural, which is just, as you said, arguably his greatest speech, only 700 words? Just, did it take time for people to see it in a positive light?
It did. Lincoln befriended Weed. You know, I mentioned Seward's campaign manager, Weed, and he befriended him, and he told Weed he didn't think this speech went over well, because any speech saying we're all at fault is not going to go over well. but he said he expected it to wear as well as anything he ever wrote, and that is exactly true. But when I write about this in my book on the inauguration, but when it came out, it was a very partisan reaction. Republican papers tended to think, oh, this is pretty good, but the Democrat papers just lacerated him, saying, who does this guy think he is, speaking for God and talking about mercy after all the bloodshed he's caused? And it's quite, Lincoln faced a very vicious and divided nation. And I think a lot of that was erased from history after his assassination. Everybody came together and was so horrified and appalled that they sort of brushed out of history how divided America was over him. But, you know, if you think Trump is controversial, Lincoln was just brutally a divisive figure during that war. And I quote a lot of that in that book.
Question over there, Kira. Thank you.
If Lincoln had lived out his second term, how do you think things might have been different?
Oh, that's the great if question in history. I think Lincoln was such a skilled politician that he would have timed Reconstruction and the expansion of black rights to the public's ability to withstand it. And to me, Lincoln was just a master politician at figuring out where the public opinion stood and how far he could push it at any moment. And so I think it would have been far less devastating. Andrew Johnson was, you know, he's a brave guy. He was a military governor in Tennessee, which is like about as difficult a job as you want to have, threatened with assassination every day. But he didn't have the political skills to sort of nurture both sides. He took offense. He was thin-skinned. Lincoln didn't take offense. He thought you always have to look at the end game, where you're going, what your goals are, and not let personal differences get in the way. So God knows, but it was, you know, it was such a horrible thing for the country. You had millions and millions of uneducated black Americans who if you handed over political power immediately to them, they take over the whole South. And the people who built the South were would resist that with weapons and arms, even after the war. So it had to be done in a very delicate way. And Lincoln definitely did stand for expanding opportunity and rights to everybody, no matter what color. But he would have done it, I think, in a more cautious way.
Peter, question right here.
This is a little bit more personal, but coming from an investigative background, can you speak on the advantage that you may enjoy on looking at the data and transferring that into your writings versus an academic who may approach it from a little bit more biased perspective?
Yeah, I think coming to it as a journalist, I sort of, one thing I understand, all these politicians are not godlike figures. If you see them up close, you realize they're not. They're all doing things for their own political advantage, and that gives you a sort of background, a grounding to go into 1860s politics and understand that better. But also, you know, as a journalist, you love a good story. You love to be able to tell a story. You don't want to drone on too long. You want to get to it, and you know, you understand how details give you a sense of the richness of the story. So that's basically what I brought to it from journalism. You know, what I try to do in all these books is make you feel like you are there. I try to write this history as if I didn't know what's going to happen on the next page. And I think that gives it this sort of an immediacy that's helpful.
Question in the back here.
Thank you for your talk. It was fascinating. Could you elaborate a little on what happened to Simon Cameron? I think it's interesting as an illustration of Lincoln's passion for honesty. He was the Secretary of War, I believe, initially, and then something happened to him. Maybe you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, so the Lincoln's men had promised him the Treasury Department, and Lincoln was no way going to do that. That was just too important a position. So he gave it to Salmon Chase, who was actually a very distinguished, smart guy, although a total egomaniac. But Simon Cameron, Lincoln chose him for the War Department, and he was a disaster as the Secretary of War. You've heard of the phrase shoddy goods. Well, that comes from Cameron's service as Secretary of War. There was all sorts of rank corruption going on in government contracts, and the soldiers were left with just this terrible products on the battlefield and so forth. And Lincoln finally had to force Cameron out, and he sent him off to Russia as an ambassador. And he brought in this guy, this former Democrat, who actually had worked with Lincoln as a lawyer and despised Lincoln, called him a gorilla and so forth. But Lincoln didn't take offense, as usual. He brought him in. He was very good, Edwin Stanton. And he was a superb Secretary of War through the rest of the war. He was sort of the bad cop to Lincoln's good cop. He said he would always, people complaining, oh, go off and see Mr. Stanton. He'll take care of you. And then Stanton would scream at him or something. So in Cameron, but Lincoln, as I say, he forms no resentments against anyone. He brings Cameron back, and in 1865, Cameron was there in the well of the Senate talking to people, trying to bring them over to Lincoln's side on various things. And Lincoln maintained a good relationship with him as a political insider who was able to pull strings. So,
Just a footnote on that for those who, I know some of you know, Simon Cameron,
Yes.
Pennsylvanian, Union League member. Kira, we have a question right here.
what else?
Oh, hello, I'm here. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So was there any support at all for Lincoln from anyone in the South, even covertly?
Almost none. Almost none. In fact, early on in the war, Lincoln sent people down to like Charleston to try to find out if there's any sentiment for the Union left, and he couldn't find any. The whole region was turned against Lincoln, and once Lincoln felt compelled to resupply Fort Sumter, to hold on to that as a symbol that we're not going to just give up our country. We're going to hold on to this. And of course, the Southerners fired on it and drove the Union out of the fort. The Lincoln had to determine that he had to fight this war, and the border states that had slavery, who had been sort of reluctantly staying in the Union, all bolted. So Lincoln did not have support from the South. He tried to cultivate his support for the Union any way he could during that war. But you can imagine the hatred stirred by a civil war, especially when Lincoln freed the slaves and armed them to come shoot the people who they used to be slaves to. So it was a very bitter and feelings of great hatred by the end of that war. And of course, Sherman's march through the South was intended to send a message. It's ridiculous to keep fighting this war, and we're going to just brutalize you until you stop. And so Lincoln had a real project in front of him trying to bring this country together. And I always thought the second inaugural was an extraordinary message to try to do that. But, yeah.
Here, question right there.
So, a wonderful talk, and I love the personal dimension to it. And along those lines, I was just wondering, what happened to that 12-year-old Gracie who told the presidential candidate to get rid of his beard?
Grace Bedell, yes. I think Lincoln visited her while he was traveling. He did this long, circuitous route from Springfield, Illinois to the White House, and he visited her during that. And I don't think I've ever researched what finally became, or if I had, I didn't keep it in my porous brain. But I think she sort of lived off that story the rest of her life. But it was, it's a great little story. And Lincoln was the kind of guy who he was very amused with that. He wrote back to her and told her about he has 3 sons, and he told her all about them, and it was kind of a cute thing. And Lincoln wouldn't say anything during that campaign, so it's kind of fun to see him sort of let down a little bit with this little girl. He was under so much pressure.
Peter, one more question over here.
You've mentioned a lot of things that Lincoln did right. Grow a beard, didn't go to the convention. What did he do wrong?
What did Lincoln do wrong? Boy, that's a tough one. Boy, Lincoln could be a cold customer at times. He was so wrapped up in his own little world that he wasn't always as open with his family as he could have been. He had a terrible marriage, but I've often argued he wouldn't be president if he hadn't married Mary Lincoln, because for one thing, she made his home life so miserable that he went out on the road for 6 months a year, and he made all these friendships all over Illinois. But also, he was kind of like a plotter in a way. He was very ambitious, but she kept saying, he said things like, well, maybe I'll go back to the House of Representatives. And she said, you're not going to do that. You're going to be a senator, or you're going to be president. And, there was talk about him being vice president. You're not going to do that. You're going to be president or nothing. And this was, so I don't know, it probably was a good thing that he married Mary and she pushed him forward. So what did he do wrong? He's human. He makes mistakes. During the course of the war, some of his Illinois friends, a senator from Illinois, thought he was just too slow and sluggish, and he allowed the war to get out of hand because he wasn't decisive and strong enough. And, but I look at I keep looking for Lincoln's flaws, but I think he timed these things as well as he could have, based on the whole country had to prepare for war, had to arm the military, had to create an industrial infrastructure to support that war. And so I think if you look at all things considered, Lincoln was a pretty smart guy. So there.
So, Mr. Higgins, the answer is not much.
Yeah.
And with that, please join me in thanking
Thank you.
Edward Achorn.
So much. Do you want to mention the